Kang Hye-soo clutched the worn strap of her leather bag as she walked briskly down the busy streets of Jangwon City. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the skyscrapers, their glass facades reflecting a kaleidoscope of colors. Around her, the air buzzed with the hum of car engines, snippets of hurried conversations, and the occasional bark of a street vendor calling out for customers. But none of it registered in her mind. All she could think about was the notice plastered to her office door earlier that day: final notice of eviction. Her steps faltered for a moment as the weight of her situation pressed down on her. She was on the brink of losing the agency she had poured her heart into for years. The small investigative firm wasn't much, a shabby office tucked above a noodle shop. But it was hers. And now, unless she found a way to pay her debts, it would be gone. The sharp trill of her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. Fumbling to answer, she pressed it to her ear. "Do you want to save that office of yours or not?" The voice on the other end was gruff, but confident. Hee-soo's jaw tightened. It was Kim Dae-hyun, a journalist infamous for his relentless pursuit of high-profile scandals. She had worked with him once before, a collaboration that had been lucrative but morally dubious. "I told you, I don't do smear jobs," she replied curtly, weaving through the throng of people on the sidewalk. "This isn't a smear job," he countered, his tone light but edged with urgency. "It's an opportunity. Seo Min-jae, the Golden Group's CEO." "I know who he is," she cut in, her voice colder now. Seo Min-jae was a name synonymous with power and controversy. The man controlled half of Jangwon City through his conglomerate, and the rest through sheer intimidation. "Good. Then you know the stakes," Dae-hyun continued. "Rumors are swirling about financial fraud, illegal dealings. I want you to infiltrate his mansion and dig up the truth. The payoff? Enough to save that sorry little office of yours and then some." Hee-soo hesitated, the noise of the city fading into the background. Infiltrating the most reclusive and feared man in the business world wasn't just risky, it bordered on suicidal. But as her landlord's voice echoed in her memory, she realized she had no choice. "Send me the details," she said shortly, ending the call. The Golden Mansion stood atop a secluded hill on the outskirts of the city, its grandeur unmatched by anything Hye-soo had seen before. As she approached, the iron gates creaked open, revealing a long driveway flanked by manicured hedges and ancient trees. The air was unnervingly still, broken only by the faint chirping of crickets. The mansion itself loomed in the distance, a sprawling structure of glass and stone that gleamed faintly under the evening sky. Despite its modern design, there was something eerie about it, a sense that secrets lurked within its walls. A sharply dressed butler greeted her at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Kang, welcome. Mr. Seo is expecting you," he said, gesturing her inside. As Hye-soo stepped into the marble-floored foyer, a chill ran down her spine. The air was thick with the faint scent of cedar wood and leather, and the muted glow of chandeliers cast elongated shadows on the walls. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she followed the butler through a series of hallways, each more opulent than the last. Finally, they stopped at a set of double doors. The butler opened them with a quiet flourish, and there he was, Seo Min-jae. He was taller than she had imagined, his sharp suit tailored to perfection. His jet-black hair was neatly combed back, emphasizing the strong lines of his jaw and the piercing coldness in his dark eyes. Those eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt as though he could see straight through her. "Ms. Kang," he said, his voice smooth yet commanding. "You're here to work, not to gawk. Let's make that clear from the start." Hye-soo straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I understand, Mr. Seo," she replied evenly, though her heart pounded in her chest. As she was shown to her quarters, Hye-soo couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. The mansion was a fortress, and Min-jae was its enigmatic king. She would have to tread carefully if she wanted to uncover the secrets buried within these gilded walls. Later that night, as she unpacked her belongings, she noticed something odd. On her way to the room, she had passed a door partially hidden at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Unlike the other doors, this one was scratched and worn, as though someone had tried to claw their way through it. She couldn't explain it, but the sight of that door sent a shiver down her spine. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Kang Hye-soo's room, but the warmth did little to melt the unease coiled in her chest. She had spent a restless night replaying every detail of the mansion in her mind, especially that mysterious, clawed-up door. What could have happened there? A mistake from her childhood, curiosity without caution, flashed through her thoughts, but she brushed it away. This wasn't the time to let her mind wander. The schedule she had been handed the night before left no room for improvisation. Min-jae's life ran like clockwork, every minute accounted for, and Hye-soo was expected to fit seamlessly into the machine. As she descended the grand staircase to the main hall, she heard voices echoing from the dining room. The scene before her was almost surreal. Seo Min-jae sat at the head of a long mahogany table, sipping coffee from a pristine white cup. His every movement was deliberate, from the way he stirred his drink to the way he set the spoon down with a soft clink. His tailored suit, despite being casual by his standards, still exuded an aura of untouchable authority. When his gaze lifted to meet hers, the air seemed to tighten. "You're late," he said simply, setting the cup down. Hye-soo fought the instinct to apologize, opting instead for calm professionalism. "I wasn't informed breakfast was a timed event," she replied, her voice even but not submissive. A flicker of amusement crossed his face, so fleeting that she might have imagined it. "In this house, everything is," he replied, gesturing for her to take the seat nearest to him. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the faint clink of cutlery against porcelain. Hye-soo couldn't help but notice how the dining room, like the rest of the mansion, felt oversized and empty. Though the space was immaculate, it lacked warmth, as if it were a stage rather than a home. After breakfast, her tasks began in earnest. Min-jae assigned her to catalog a set of documents in his office, a cavernous room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The rich scent of leather and aged paper filled the air as she worked, her fingers grazing the edges of thick, expensive stationery. Her focus, however, was constantly interrupted by the man himself. Min-jae's presence was magnetic, and not in a way that was entirely comfortable. He moved around the room with quiet precision, seemingly oblivious to her scrutiny. Yet every so often, she would catch him watching her from the corner of his eye, as though assessing whether she was a piece that fit into his carefully curated puzzle. Their first real clash came that afternoon. While organizing the documents, Hye-soo came across an unsigned contract buried among them. Something about the language caught her attention. Vague phrasing, untraceable beneficiaries. It was the kind of detail an investigator couldn't ignore. "Mr. Seo," she began, holding the paper aloft. "This contract looks irregular." Min-jae turned slowly from where he stood near the window, his expression inscrutable. "Irregular?" he repeated, his voice like velvet stretched over steel. Hye-soo swallowed hard but held her ground. "It's just an observation. The terms seem intentionally unclear." "You're here to assist, not to question my business dealings," he interrupted, his tone sharper now. He stepped closer, and the sudden proximity sent a jolt through her. "Learn your place, Miss Kang." Hye-soo clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around the paper. For a moment, the tension crackled like a live wire between them. But then, with a deep breath, she nodded curtly and returned the document to its folder. The day dragged on, each interaction between them fraught with unspoken challenges. By the time evening arrived, Hye-soo found herself back in her room, her thoughts spinning. She knew this job wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated the way Seo Min-jae would get under her skin, both professionally and personally. As the sky outside darkened, she decided to take a walk through the mansion. The corridors were quieter at night, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by thick carpets. She passed room after room, each one grander than the last, until she found herself back at that hallway, the one with the clawed-up door. This time, curiosity overrode caution. Hye-soo stepped closer, the air around her growing heavier. The scratches on the wood looked deliberate, desperate. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the splintered surface. That door's off limits. The voice behind her made her jump, her hand snapping back as if burned. She turned to see Min-jae standing a few feet away, his expression shadowed in the dim light. "I was just exploring?" he cut in, his tone deceptively calm. He stepped closer, and she caught the faint scent of cedarwood and cologne. "Let me make this clear, Ms. Kang. There are places in this house where you don't belong. That door is one of them." Hye-soo met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Understood," she said quietly, though the fire in her eyes betrayed her agreement. As Min-jae turned and walked away, the tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Hye-soo knew she should heed his warning, but the investigator in her couldn't let it go. What was he hiding behind that door, and why was he so adamant about keeping her away? The next morning, Kang Hye-soo awoke to a sharp knock at her door. The sound startled her, and she sat up abruptly, her heart pounding from the remnants of a vivid dream she couldn't quite remember. Blinking against the golden morning light that spilled through the curtains, she called out, "One moment," as she hurriedly pulled on her cardigan. Opening the door, she found a young maid with an apologetic expression standing outside. "Ms. Kang, Mr. Seo requests your presence in the garden." Her tone was polite, but the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. "Of course," Hye-soo replied, masking her surprise. She hadn't expected Min-jae to summon her this early. The garden was an unexpected contrast to the cold, sterile interior of the mansion. It sprawled with meticulously maintained hedges, vibrant flower beds, and a small pond where koi fish glided lazily under the surface. The air was fresh, carrying a faint scent of jasmine that was almost calming. Min-jae stood near the pond, dressed in a light gray suit that seemed impossibly perfect, even in the soft morning light. His back was to her, but his posture, rigid yet deliberate, carried the same air of authority that made her feel constantly on edge. "I trust you slept well," he said without turning, his voice breaking the serene quiet of the garden. "Well enough," Hye-soo replied, stepping closer. "You wanted to see me?" He turned then, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that always made her want to step back, though she refused to. "You'll be attending an event with me this evening," he said simply. "It's a corporate gathering. Be ready by 7. Hye-soo blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness of his demand. "I wasn't aware that attending events was part of my job description." "It is now." His tone left no room for argument, but there was a glint of something in his expression. Amusement, perhaps, that made her bristle. By the time evening arrived, Hye-soo found herself reluctantly stepping into a sleek black car waiting in the driveway. Her reflection in the car window revealed an image she hardly recognized. Her usual practical attire replaced by a navy blue evening gown that clung to her frame in a way that felt almost too elegant. She had Woo-shik to thank for that. His hurried delivery of the dress earlier in the day had come with a cheeky, "You owe me for this one." Min-jae was already seated inside, his gaze flickering briefly over her before he returned to whatever message he was typing on his phone. The ride into the city was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of fabric as Hye-soo adjusted her dress. The event itself was a dazzling display of opulence. Chandeliers glittered overhead, casting golden light onto a sea of polished executives and socialites. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere buzzed with muted conversation and the faint notes of a string quartet playing in the corner, as Hye-soo moved through the room alongside Min-jae. She couldn't help but notice the way people gravitated toward him. His presence commanded attention effortlessly, yet he seemed detached, as though the event, and everyone in it, was beneath his notice. "Hye-soo, is it?" The voice startled her, and she turned to see a woman in her mid-30s, poised and elegant, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. This was Choi Mi-young, Min-jae's trusted legal advisor. "Yes," Hye-soo replied cautiously, extending her hand. "And you must be." "Mi-young," the woman interjected with a thin smile, shaking her hand briefly. "I've heard a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," Hye-soo said, her voice light but wary. "Time will tell," Mi-young replied, her gaze flickering briefly to Min-jae, who was engaged in conversation nearby. There was an edge to her tone, a subtle warning that Hye-soo couldn't quite place. As the night wore on, Hye-soo began to notice a pattern. Though Min-jae spoke little, his mere presence seemed to dominate the room, and every interaction was carefully calculated. She also couldn't ignore the subtle tension that hung in the air. Furtive glances, hushed conversations. It was as though everyone present was playing a game, and Min-jae held the winning cards. Her thoughts were interrupted when a man approached her, a journalist she recognized instantly. Kim Dae-hyun. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping aside to avoid drawing attention. "I should be asking you the same thing," he replied, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Making yourself cozy with Seo Min-jae, I see. Don't forget why you're here, Kang Hye-soo." "I haven't forgotten," she said through gritted teeth. "But you need to leave. Now." "Careful," Dae-hyun said with a smirk, leaning in slightly. "You're starting to sound like you care about him." Hye-soo froze, but before she could respond, a shadow loomed over them. She turned to see Min-jae, his expression dark and unreadable. "Is there a problem?" he asked smoothly, his eyes flicking between her and Dae-hyun. "No," Hye-soo said quickly, stepping away from the journalist. "Just a misunderstanding." Min-jae's gaze lingered on Dae-hyun for a moment longer, his silence more threatening than any words could have been. Finally, he turned to Hye-soo. "We're leaving." Back at the mansion, the tension between them was palpable. Hye-soo knew she had come dangerously close to exposing her true purpose, and Min-jae's sharp gaze told her he suspected something. "You seem to attract trouble, Ms. Kang," he said as they stood in the dimly lit foyer. "Only when I'm following orders," she replied, her tone biting despite the knot of nerves in her stomach. Min-jae's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Careful. This house has little tolerance for disobedience." As he walked away, his words lingered, a subtle warning that felt far more personal than professional. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and subtle tension. Kang Hye-soo had fallen into a rhythm of quiet observation, careful not to draw too much attention to herself. Yet, the more she observed Seo Min-jae, the more questions she had. He was a man of precision, his every move calculated, but there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, where something raw flickered behind his composed exterior. Her instincts told her to keep her distance, but the investigator in her couldn't resist digging deeper. Late one evening, as the mansion grew quiet, Hye-soo found herself wandering again. The halls, dimly lit by sconces, felt alive with shadows, and every soft creak of the floor beneath her feet sent a shiver up her spine. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for, but her curiosity kept pulling her forward. The clawed-up door from her first night came back into view, looming at the end of the hallway like a silent challenge. Hye-soo glanced around, ensuring she was alone, before approaching it. Her fingers hesitated over the handle, and for a moment, she considered turning back. But the faintest draft of cool air seeped through the cracks, carrying with it a hint of something. Was it earth, or perhaps damp wood? When she tried the handle, it didn't budge. Locked. Of course, she thought, But as she examined the frame more closely, her eyes caught something glinting in the dim light. A small keyhole, old and ornate, nestled at the side of the door. The sound of footsteps made her heart leap into her throat. Quickly she stepped back, pressing herself into the shadows of an alcove, just as Seo Min-jae appeared at the other end of the hallway. He wasn't alone. With him was Choi Mi-young, her voice sharp yet controlled as they spoke in hushed tones. "I've already dealt with the press," Mi-young said, her words clipped. "But if this leaks any further, even you won't be able to stop it." "It won't," Min-jae replied evenly. His tone betrayed no emotion, but there was an edge to his words, like a warning wrapped in silk. Mi-young folded her arms, her gaze hard. "You're taking too many risks. She's a liability." Hye-soo's chest tightened. She didn't know who they were referring to. Her, perhaps. Or someone else. Either way, the conversation only deepened her suspicions. "She'll do what's expected of her," Min-jae said finally, before turning and walking away, leaving Mi-young standing in the hallway. The next morning, Hye-soo was summoned to Min-jae's office. The room was bathed in warm sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished desk and the shelves lined with leather-bound books. Min-jae sat behind the desk, his expression unreadable as usual, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that made her stomach churn. "You've been exploring," he said without preamble, his voice calm yet laced with accusation. Hye-soo's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I've been learning my surroundings." "Is that what you call it?" His lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let me give you some advice, Ms. Kang. In this house, curiosity is a dangerous habit." "I wasn't aware curiosity was forbidden," she replied, her tone carefully measured. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then, Min-jae leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You'll accompany me to the Foundation archives this afternoon. There's work to be done, and I'll need your assistance." The archives were housed in a separate wing of the mansion, accessible only by a private staircase. As they descended, the air grew cooler, and the faint scent of aged paper and wood filled Hye-soo's senses. The room they entered was vast, lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, crammed with documents, ledgers, and old photographs. Min-jae moved through the space with practiced ease, pulling a set of files from a locked cabinet. "These records need to be sorted," he said, placing them on a nearby table. "Start with these. I'll return shortly." As soon as he left, Hye-soo's instincts kicked in. She scanned the files quickly, her fingers skimming over contracts and correspondence. Most of it seemed routine, but one file stood out, a series of letters addressed to Min-jae, marked confidential. Hesitation gripped her for a moment, but she couldn't ignore the chance to find answers. Carefully, she opened the file. What she found inside stopped her breath. The letters detailed financial transactions tied to an unknown beneficiary. They were vague but suggested large sums being funneled to someone outside the company. Accompanying the letters was a photograph of a woman, a young, elegant figure standing in front of what appeared to be the very mansion Hye-soo now stood in. "Enjoying yourself?" The voice startled her, and she spun around to see Min-jae standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Her hand shot out to close the file, but it was too late. She scrambled for an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Min-jae stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the file. "You have a talent for overstepping boundaries," he said coolly, though his voice carried a dangerous undertone. "I was just—" "Stop," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "You want answers? Fine. Let me give you one." Hye-soo froze, her pulse racing as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This house isn't what it seems, and neither am I." The weight of Seo Min-jae's words lingered in the room like an unshakable fog. Kang Hye-soo stood frozen, her mind racing to parse the implications of what he'd just said. His tone had been calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it, a warning cloaked in ambiguity. Min-jae straightened, his gaze cutting through the silence. "Finish the task I assigned, and this time," he said, his voice low but firm, "stay within the boundaries of your job." Hye-soo opened her mouth to respond, but he had already turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the vast archive room. The file she'd been caught reading still lay on the table, its contents now an even deeper mystery. The rest of the day passed with Hye-soo on edge. She carried out her duties with meticulous precision, mindful of Min-jae's watchful eyes. Yet, despite his warning, her curiosity only grew stronger. What had he meant about the house not being what it seemed? Who was the woman in the photograph? That evening, she decided to confront Woo-shik. Sitting in her room with her laptop open, she dialed his number. The call connected almost immediately. "You sound tense," Woo-shik said, his voice playful as always. "That mansion getting to you already?" "There's more going on here than I thought," Hye-soo replied, lowering her voice as she glanced at the door. "I found documents, transactions tied to an unknown beneficiary, and there's this photo of a woman outside the mansion. She has to be connected to Min-jae, but I don't know how." Woo-shik's tone grew serious. "You need to be careful, Hye-soo. This isn't just another job. If you push too hard—" "I know," she cut in, though the conviction in her voice wavered. "But I can't ignore it." The next day, Hye-soo found herself in unfamiliar territory, working directly alongside Min-jae. He had summoned her to assist with a presentation for an upcoming board meeting, a task she suspected was more about testing her than needing her help. The atmosphere in his office was tense, but not hostile. Min-jae, as always, exuded quiet authority, his movements precise and deliberate. Hye-soo couldn't help but notice the contrast between his composed exterior and the occasional flicker of something deeper in his eyes. Frustration, perhaps, or even fatigue. At one point, as they reviewed a series of slides, their hands brushed when reaching for the same document. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through Hye-soo. She glanced up, only to find Min-jae watching her with an unreadable expression. "Do you always overanalyze everything?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Only when the situation calls for it," she replied, refusing to back down. To her surprise, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was the first time she'd seen anything resembling warmth from him, and it left her momentarily disarmed. Later that night, Hye-soo found herself drawn back to the archives. The mansion was quiet, the usual sounds of staff bustling through the halls absent. She moved carefully, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet as she descended the private staircase. The air in the archive room felt heavier this time, and a faint chill prickled her skin. Hye-soo hesitated at the threshold, but the memory of the photo in the file propelled her forward. She needed answers. Her search was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, and heading straight for her. Panic shot through her as she scrambled to hide behind one of the shelves. The footsteps stopped, and Hye-soo held her breath. Through the gaps in the books, she saw a figure enter the room. It wasn't Min-jae, but Choi Mi-young, her expression sharp and focused as she began rifling through one of the cabinets. Hye-soo's heart pounded. What was Mi-young doing here so late? And why did she look so intent on whatever she was searching for? The next morning, Hye-soo was summoned to Min-jae's office again. This time, his demeanor was different. Less formal, more guarded. He gestured for her to sit, and for a moment, he simply studied her, as though weighing a decision. "I'm aware of what you've been doing," he said finally, his tone calm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. Hye-soo stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "You've been digging," he continued, ignoring her denial. I warned you about the dangers of curiosity, but you don't seem to listen. I'm just trying to do my job, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Min-jae leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. If that's true, then you'll stop now. There are things in this house you're better off not knowing. What kind of things? Hye-soo asked, her voice steady despite the knot of nerves in her stomach. For a moment, Min-jae said nothing, his gaze piercing. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair. There's someone you need to meet, he said cryptically. Be ready tomorrow morning. The tension between them remained as they left the office. Min-jae's cryptic words swirled in Hye-soo's mind, leaving her restless. Who was he planning to introduce her to? And why now? That night, as she stared out the window of her room, the golden lights of the city shimmering in the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something monumental. Whatever tomorrow brought, she knew it would change everything. Morning arrived cloaked in tension, the golden rays of sunlight streaming through the windows doing little to ease Kang Hye-soo's growing unease. Min-jae's cryptic words from the day before played in her mind as she prepared herself, her reflection in the mirror revealing a face both determined and wary. At precisely 8 o'clock, a knock echoed through her room. Hye-soo opened the door to find a chauffeur waiting, his expression professionally neutral. Mr. Seo has instructed me to take you to the meeting point, he said simply. The car ride was eerily quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as the city blurred past the tinted windows. Hye-soo's fingers tapped against her thigh, a nervous habit she couldn't suppress. Her thoughts swirled with questions. Who was she about to meet? And why had Min-jae deemed it important enough to involve her? The car pulled into the driveway of an unassuming building on the outskirts of the city. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Golden Mansion, a small, unremarkable structure surrounded by overgrown shrubs and cracked pavement. Hye-soo stepped out of the car, her heels crunching against the gravel. Min-jae was already waiting by the entrance, his tall figure silhouetted against the gray facade. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but there was a tension in his posture that set her on edge. "Follow me," he said, his voice curt as he turned and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior of the building was dimly lit, the faint smell of antiseptic mingling with the mustiness of old wood. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and oppressive, until it opened into a small, sterile room furnished with only a single table and 2 chairs. Sitting in one of those chairs was a woman Hye-soo didn't recognize. She was in her mid-40s, with tired eyes and a fragile frame that suggested a long and difficult life. Despite her worn appearance, there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. "This is Mrs. Yoon," Min-jae said, his tone devoid of emotion. "She's the person you've been looking for, even if you didn't know it." Hye-soo blinked, confusion clouding her features. "I don't understand." "You will," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Reluctantly, Hye-soo took the seat across from Mrs. Yoon, who regarded her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Mrs. Yoon," Min-jae continued, "is my mother's former housekeeper. She worked at the Golden Mansion for over 20 years. Hye-soo's breath caught. The pieces began to shift into place, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. "Tell her," Min-jae said quietly, his gaze fixed on the older woman. Mrs. Yoon hesitated, her hands twisting together in her lap. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I was there the night it happened," she began. "The night, the tragedy in the mansion." The room seemed to close in around Hye-soo as Mrs. Yoon recounted the story. Years ago, when Min-jae was just a boy, a devastating fire had broken out in the mansion. The flames had consumed an entire wing, and his mother, Min-jae's only surviving parent, had perished in the blaze. The official story was an accident, Mrs. Yoon said, her voice heavy with sorrow. But it wasn't. Someone set that fire on purpose, and they wanted her dead. Hye-soo's stomach churned. Why would someone do that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Yoon's gaze flickered to Min-jae, then back to Hye-soo. Because of what she knew. She had evidence, proof of corruption in the Golden Group. She was going to expose them, but she never got the chance. Min-jae's voice broke through the silence, cold and measured. That's why the mansion isn't just my home. It's a graveyard of secrets. And it's why I've done everything I can to protect what remains. Hye-soo stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of betrayal, cover-ups, and years of carefully concealed truths. And now, she was entangled in it. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Because you've already stepped too far into the shadows, Min-jae replied, his gaze piercing. And because I need you to understand what's at stake. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been hurt by this company. Hye-soo's hands clenched into fists. If that's true, why keep working for them? Why not bring them down yourself? Min-jae's lips pressed into a thin line. Because revenge requires patience, and because sometimes the only way to destroy a monster is from the inside. The ride back to the mansion was suffocatingly silent. Hye-soo sat with her arms crossed, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. Her mind raced with everything she had learned, the puzzle pieces falling into place in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time since taking this job, she felt something beyond curiosity driving her forward. She felt anger at the people who had hurt Min-jae and his family, and anger at herself for ever doubting him. But there was one lingering question she couldn't ignore. If Min-jae's enemies were willing to kill once, how far would they go to protect their secrets now? The Golden Mansion felt different that night, as if the air itself had thickened with tension. Kang Hye-soo returned to her room in a daze, Mrs. Yoon's revelations and Seo Min-jae's cold determination playing on a loop in her mind. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, but the cool liquid did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. Everything about Min-jae's story, the fire, his mother's death, the concealed corruption, reshaped the man she thought she knew. But what disturbed her most wasn't the depth of his pain. It was the growing realization that she wanted to help him. The next morning, Hye-soo forced herself to follow the routine Min-jae had meticulously laid out for her. She cataloged files in the study, sorted documents, and avoided his gaze whenever they crossed paths. But every so often, she caught him watching her, his dark eyes like storm clouds brewing with unspoken thoughts. By mid-afternoon, Min-jae summoned her to his office. The room was bathed in golden sunlight, the contrast to their conversation only making her nerves more raw. "We have a problem," he said, his voice clipped. He slid a tablet across the desk toward her. "This was sent to me this morning." Hye-soo picked up the device and stared at the screen. It displayed a photo of her and Kim Dae-hyun from the corporate event a few nights prior. The two of them appeared locked in a tense conversation, their expressions frozen in mid-discussion. Her stomach dropped. "Where did this come from?" "The sender is anonymous," Min-jae replied, leaning back in his chair. "But the implication is clear. Someone knows who you are, and they're using it to get to me." Hye-soo's mind raced. She had been careful, but apparently not careful enough. Whoever had taken this photo clearly intended to expose her as a spy. And if Min-jae hadn't already guessed her true motives, this would all but confirm it. "I can explain," she began. But Min-jae held up a hand to silence her. "Save your explanations," he said, his voice like steel. "Right now, there's only one question that matters. Are you on my side or theirs?" The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating in its intensity. Hye-soo hesitated, her heart pounding as she tried to decide how much to reveal. Finally, she met his gaze, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. I'm on your side." For a moment, Min-jae said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he stood and turned toward the window, his back to her. "If that's true, then you'll prove it tonight." Min-jae wasted no time outlining the plan. He had received word that a critical meeting of Golden Group executives was set to take place that evening at a private estate outside the city. The meeting wasn't on the official schedule, which meant whatever they were discussing was meant to stay hidden. "You're coming with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hye-soo frowned. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" "You're going to help me expose them," he replied. "We'll gather evidence, documents, recordings, anything we can use to prove what they're doing." The estate was a stark contrast to the Golden Mansion. Where Min-jae's home exuded cold elegance, this place felt alive with warmth and light. Laughter spilled out into the garden where guests mingled, glasses of champagne in hand. The scent of freshly cut roses filled the air, mixing with the faint notes of classical music drifting from inside. Hye-soo stayed close to Min-jae, her nerves on edge as they navigated the crowd. Her simple black dress allowed her to blend in, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching her. Min-jae was a master at commanding a room, his charisma drawing people to him effortlessly. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, Hye-soo could sense the tightly coiled tension in his movements. When the moment came, Min-jae excused himself from the gathering and signaled for Hye-soo to follow. They slipped through a side door into a dimly lit corridor, their footsteps muffled by thick carpet. The study they entered was richly appointed, with mahogany furniture and a faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air. Min-jae moved swiftly, scanning the shelves and drawers for anything of value. Hye-soo's role was to keep watch, but her instincts told her something wasn't right. The silence of the house was too perfect, too deliberate. "Min-jae," she whispered urgently, "we need to hurry." He didn't respond, his focus locked on a stack of ledgers he had just uncovered. The sound of footsteps approaching shattered the quiet, and Hye-soo's heart leapt into her throat. "Someone's coming," she hissed, grabbing his arm. Before they could react, the door swung open, revealing Choi Mi-young, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice low but furious. Min-jae didn't flinch. "Gathering the truth," he replied evenly. Mi-young stepped closer, her gaze flicking to Hye-soo. "You've made a mistake bringing her into this," she said coldly. "You don't know who you can trust anymore." The confrontation was interrupted by another sound. This time, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. All three of them froze as a man stepped out from the shadows, his face obscured by the dim light. "You should have stayed in your lane, Min-jae," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. Hye-soo's breath caught as she realized just how dangerous the stakes had become. The room seemed to shrink as the man stepped closer, the polished barrel of the gun glinting faintly in the dim light. Kang Hye-soo's instinct screamed at her to move, but her feet remained rooted to the floor. The tension was suffocating, each second stretching into eternity as she exchanged a quick, panicked glance with Seo Min-jae. "Step away from the desk," the man commanded, his voice cold and steady. Min-jae raised his hands slowly, his movements deliberate as he stepped in front of Hye-soo, shielding her with his body. "There's no need for this," he said, his tone calm but edged with authority. "Let's talk." The intruder's eyes narrowed, his grip on the weapon unwavering. "Talk? That's rich coming from you. Do you have any idea what you've jeopardized by sticking your nose where it doesn't belong?" Min-jae's expression hardened. "You mean exposing the lies that have ruined lives? Oh, I know exactly what I've jeopardized." The man's lips twisted into a sneer, and for a moment, Hye-soo thought he might pull the trigger. But before he could act, Choi Mi-young stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough," she snapped, her tone sharp but composed. "Put the gun down." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering toward her. "Mi-young, you can't seriously—" "I said, put it down," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. This isn't the way to handle this." Reluctantly, the man lowered the weapon, his jaw clenched with barely suppressed anger. Hye-soo exhaled a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her legs weak with relief. Mi-young turned to Min-jae, her expression grim. "We need to leave. Now, before anyone else finds out you were here." Min-jae didn't argue, gathering the ledgers he had uncovered and slipping them into his briefcase. Hye-soo followed closely as they exited the study, the tension still thick in the air. The car ride back to the mansion was steeped in silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the engine. Hye-soo sat beside Min-jae, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every so often she stole a glance at him, but his face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. It wasn't until they reached the safety of the Golden Mansion that he finally spoke. "You shouldn't have come tonight," he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual edge. Hye-soo bristled at his tone. "You're the one who asked me to come," she shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "What was I supposed to do? Leave you to face them alone?" Min-jae turned to her, his eyes dark and filled with something she couldn't quite name. Anger, yes, but also fear. "Yes, if it meant keeping you safe," he replied, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't a game, Hye-soo. The people we're dealing with don't hesitate to destroy anything, or anyone in their way." The weight of his words settled over her, heavy and suffocating. "I'm not afraid of them," she said softly, her resolve firm despite the tremor in her voice. "You should be," Min-jae countered, his gaze boring into hers. For a moment, the walls he so carefully maintained seemed to crack, and she caught a glimpse of the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. "You don't know what they're capable of." Hye-soo reached out, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "I know enough," she said gently. "And I know you can't do this alone." Min-jae's gaze dropped to where her hand rested, and for a fleeting moment his expression softened. But just as quickly the mask returned, and he stepped back, breaking the contact. "Get some rest," he said curtly, before turning and walking away. The following day brought no reprieve. Hye-soo threw herself into work, sorting through the ledgers and files they had retrieved from the estate. Each document painted a damning picture of the corruption at the heart of the Golden Group: money laundering, embezzlement, and ties to powerful figures who operated above the law. As the hours passed, a sense of purpose began to take root within her. This wasn't just about helping Min-jae anymore. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring justice for those who had been silenced. Woo-shik called that evening, his tone unusually serious. "Hye-soo, I've been digging into the fire at the mansion," he said, "and I found something you're not going to like." Her grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "There's a connection between the Golden Group and Kim Dae-hyun," Woo-shik revealed. "The journalist who hired you? He's been on their payroll for years." The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. "You're saying he knew all along?" "It looks that way," Woo-shik replied. "He probably hired you to stir things up, knowing it would distract Min-jae while they worked on covering their tracks." Hye-soo's mind reeled. She had trusted Dae-hyun, however reluctantly, and now it seemed he had used her as a pawn in his own twisted game. As she ended the call, a new resolve burned within her. If Dae-hyun thought he could manipulate her, he was sorely mistaken. She would uncover the truth, not for him, but for herself and for Min-jae. That night, as she sat alone in her room, Hye-soo's thoughts drifted to Min-jae. Despite their differences and the walls he put up, she couldn't deny the connection that had grown between them. He had let her into his world, trusted her with his secrets, and she couldn't walk away now. Not when the stakes were higher than ever. The moon hung low over the Golden Mansion that night, its silver light spilling through the large windows of the grand hall. Kang Hye-soo stood near the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames as her thoughts churned. Woo-shik's revelation about Kim Dae-hyun had rattled her. She felt foolish for ever believing she had control over this situation. Still, one thing remained clear. She wasn't about to let herself, or Seo Min-jae, become collateral in someone else's game. Her resolve steeled as she turned from the fire, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. She needed to speak to Min-jae, to confront him about the truth they both had been dancing around for too long. She found him in his study, sitting behind the large mahogany desk, papers scattered across the surface. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast shadows over his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the furrow in his brow. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, stepping into the room. Min-jae looked up, his expression briefly softening at the sight of her. "Not when there's work to do," he replied, leaning back in his chair. Hye-soo hesitated for a moment before walking closer. "We need to talk." "About Dae-hyun," she continued, her voice firm. "He's been working with your enemies. He knew everything about me before he even hired me." Min-jae's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't speak. Then he stood, pacing to the window and staring out into the dark expanse of the garden. "I suspected as much," he said finally, his tone low and measured. "But hearing it confirmed doesn't make it any easier." Hye-soo took a step closer, her heart pounding. "Min-jae, I didn't know. I never wanted to be part of this." "You are part of this," he interrupted, turning to face her. "Whether you wanted to be or not." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft crackling of the fire. "Why did you let me stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Min-jae's gaze held hers, his dark eyes unreadable. "Because I need someone I can trust, and despite everything, I trust you." The confession caught her off guard, and for a moment, she could only stare at him. Then she took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm here, Min-jae," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside her. "Not because of Dae-hyun, or because of some job. I'm here because I believe in what you're trying to do. And because..." She hesitated, her heart pounding. "Because I care about you." Min-jae's breath hitched almost imperceptibly, his mask of composure slipping for just a moment. Slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "I've spent my whole life not letting anyone get close," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "But you make it impossible." Their gazes locked, and for the first time, the walls between them crumbled. Min-jae leaned in, his hand moving to cup her face as their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was as though all the tension, all the unspoken words between them, finally found release. When they pulled apart, Hye-soo's cheeks were flushed, her heart racing. Min-jae rested his forehead against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't change the danger we're in. If anything, it makes it worse." "I don't care," she replied, her voice steady. "We'll face it together." The next day, the atmosphere in the mansion was tense but focused. Min-jae and Hye-soo worked side by side to piece together the evidence they had gathered. Every document, every ledger, every photograph painted a damning picture of the corruption within the Golden Group. By evening, they had everything they needed, a detailed dossier that could bring the entire operation crashing down. But just as they finished, a notification on Min-jae's phone made his blood run cold. "They know," he said, his voice grim as he turned the screen toward Hye-soo. It was a message from an unknown number. "We're coming for you. Both of you." Hye-soo's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do we do?" Min-jae's expression was unreadable as he stood, slipping the dossier into a leather briefcase. "We take this public," he said firmly. "Once the truth is out, they won't be able to touch us." Hye-soo nodded, her resolve matching his. "Then let's do it." As they prepared to leave the mansion, the weight of their decision hung heavily over them. Min-jae's hand brushed against hers, and she looked up to meet his gaze. No matter what happens, he said quietly. I won't let them hurt you. You won't have to, she replied, her voice soft but strong. We protect each other. That's how we win. With that, they stepped into the night, their fates intertwined as they prepared to face the storm together. The air was heavy as Kang Hye-soo and Seo Min-jae stepped into the crowded lobby of the broadcast station. Every step echoed with purpose. The leather briefcase clutched tightly in Min-jae's hand, holding the culmination of their efforts. The truth that would bring the Golden Group to its knees. Hye-soo scanned the space nervously, her heart hammering in her chest. The weight of what they were about to do pressed against her ribs like a vice. Around them, reporters bustled with equipment, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. We're doing the right thing, she whispered, glancing at Min-jae. His gaze was steady, his voice calm, but resolute. Right doesn't mean safe, Hye-soo. Be ready for anything. They were led to a conference room deep within the station by a producer who had been tipped off about the exposé. The room was small, dimly lit and stifling, but it offered the one thing they needed most: privacy. Min-jae placed the briefcase on the table, opening it with deliberate care. Inside were the documents and flash drives containing the damning evidence of corruption, embezzlement, and murder tied to the Golden Group's leadership. This is everything, he said, sliding the materials across the table. We need to make it public before they can stop us. The producer nodded, his face pale but determined. We'll air it tonight. This kind of story doesn't wait. As they left the room, Hye-soo felt a sliver of hope rising in her chest. The weight of secrecy had been unbearable, and now the truth was finally coming to light. But that hope was short-lived. The moment they stepped outside, the sharp crack of a gunshot split the air. Chaos erupted around them as people screamed and scattered. Hye-soo's breath caught as Min-jae grabbed her arm, pulling her into the nearest cover, a stone pillar near the entrance. Stay down, he hissed, his voice edged with urgency. Her heart raced as she clutched his sleeve. Min-jae, we're exposed. I know, he said, scanning the crowd with sharp eyes. They're trying to stop us, but we don't stop. From their position, Hye-soo spotted a black SUV idling near the curb, its windows tinted so dark that the occupants were invisible. Her instincts screamed danger, and she knew they had only moments before the situation escalated further. Min-jae pulled out his phone and began typing quickly. I'm sending everything to a secure server, he said. If anything happens, the truth still gets out. Min-jae, we need to move, Hye-soo urged, her voice trembling with fear and adrenaline. He nodded, his jaw tight. Stay close to me. They darted through the chaos, weaving between parked cars and panicked bystanders. The SUV roared to life, its tires screeching as it accelerated toward them. Hye-soo's lungs burned as they ran, her mind racing for a way out. Just as the vehicle closed the distance, Min-jae yanked her into an alley, their backs pressed against the cold brick wall. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder. Their pursuers weren't giving up. I'll distract them, Min-jae said, his voice low but firm. No! Hye-soo grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic. We do this together, remember? His expression softened for the briefest moment, but then he shook his head. You have to stay safe, Hye-soo. I can't lose you. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. And I can't lose you, Min-jae. We fight together. The decision was made in an instant. Hye-soo grabbed a nearby metal rod, brandishing it as a weapon, while Min-jae positioned himself in front of her. When the attackers rounded the corner, the alley erupted into chaos. Min-jae moved with precision and strength, his years of pent-up rage channeled into every strike. Hye-soo fought beside him, her instincts sharp and her resolve unwavering. Finally, the last man fell, groaning as he hit the ground. The alley was silent except for their ragged breaths. "Are you okay?" Min-jae asked, his hands gently cupping her face. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling. "But we can't stay here." By the time they returned to the mansion, dawn was breaking over the city. The golden light spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Hye-soo sat on the couch, her head in her hands as the events of the night replayed in her mind. Min-jae stood nearby, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't the kind that drove them apart. If anything, it bound them closer, the shared danger forging an unbreakable connection. Hours later, the news broke. The producer had followed through, airing the exposé in its entirety. The Golden Group's crimes were laid bare for the world to see, and the fallout was immediate. Hye-soo watched the broadcast from the living room, her chest tight with emotion as she saw the names and faces of the people who had caused so much pain. Justice was finally coming, but the cost had been high. Min-jae entered the room, his steps quiet. He sat beside her, the space between them almost non-existent. "We did it," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet relief. Hye-soo turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We did." The days that followed were a blur of media coverage, legal battles, and rebuilding. Min-jae stood at the forefront, his strength and determination inspiring those around him. Hye-soo stayed by his side, her own resolve unshaken. Together, they faced the storm, knowing they had each other to lean on. On a quiet evening weeks later, they stood in the garden of the Golden Mansion, the stars above them shimmering like diamonds. Min-jae reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Hye-soo smiled, her heart full. "And I never thought I'd fight for someone like you." As they stood together under the vast sky, their journey far from over, one thing was certain. They had found something worth fighting for, not just justice, but each other.